Alright class, I posted like the first quadrant of the unit circle over here just so you can look at it again, and if you want to write that on your notes you can, but I'm going to keep going. If you want to write it, pause. We're talking about inverse trig functions today, and what an inverse trig function is it gives you an angle instead of a ratio. So it gives an angle. Okay. There are, like for example, if I said what is sine inverse of let's pick something. How about 1/2? Alright, what I'm asking is what angle has a trig value or trig ratio of 1/2? Well, if you look over here at pi over 6, we have a 1/2 for our sine, so the answer would be pi over 6. That's kind of what I'm talking about. Okay, but there are some restrictions. Sine inverse and tangent inverse give you an angle between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, which means it gives you an angle in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. Whereas, well, and this makes sense because cosine inverse can't give you an angle in quadrant 4 because it's the same value as quadrant 1. We need to cover all the negative and positive possibilities. So because of that, cosine inverse gives you an angle between 0 and pi, which is in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2, because quadrant 2 is where cosine's negative. So remember, we don't ever use quadrant 3 for this. Okay? And I think that's all I want to say here. So let's start looking at the examples. And the first one is the one I just did up above. What is the sine inverse of 1/2? So the first thing you have to realize is this is positive, so it's going to be a quadrant 1 angle. And then you have to think, okay, well, sine is 1/2 when the angle is pi over 6. So we're done. That's all you have to do. Cosine inverse, this is going to be quadrant 1 again because it's positive. Where is the cosine or the x value? Root 2 over 2. Well, both x and y are root 2 over 2 at an angle of pi over 4. So you're telling me the end. You can go look at your unit circle to double check. Now tangent inverse, you have to remember that 1 over root 3 happens at the 30 or the pi over 6, and root 3 happens at the 60 because it's up higher and the y is bigger. Because remember, tangent is y over x. So therefore, tangent's root 3 at pi over 3. Here's where it gets a little trickier. This is now a negative sign, so we're in quadrant 4 and we want negative angles. So the reference that you guys just did, if you look at number 1, was pi over 6. Well, if I go pi over 6 the other way to get to this one where sine is negative, we would say that we're at an angle of negative pi over 6. And that's the difference. I don't want you to say 11 pi over 6. Even though technically it's the same angle, it's defined that it's going to give you an angle between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So that's what we're going to say. It's negative pi over 6. Now this one, it's cosine, so we want an angle in quadrant 2. Well, we already know that a root 2 over 2 has a reference of pi over 4. But if I'm in quadrant 2, I'm going to just quickly draw my unit circle here, and I'm at pi over 4 reference, you have to think about what that angle is. Well, if you guys know that 180 degrees is 4 over 4, or pi, so one less than that would be 3 pi over 4, because it's a pi over 4 reference there. And then finally, this is in quadrant 4. This was in quadrant 1 because it was positive. Quadrant 4, so we're just going down the same amount we went up. So tangent inverse of negative root 3 will be negative pi over 3. So the quadrant 4 and 1 are easy. You just slap a negative on front of the quadrant 1 angle. But it's when you get cosine, you have to figure out what is going on there. So, all right, and the last thing we're going to do is solve the equations. So to solve equations, remember that sine kind of undoes a sine inverse. Okay, so for example, if I'm solving this, I'd first divide by 2. So I have cosine inverse of x equals pi over 2. Now to solve this, I'm going to take the cosine of both sides, because the cosine of the cosine inverse leaves me with just x. It's saying what angle gives you a ratio, and then once we find the angle, what is the ratio at that angle? Well, it's the same thing that we started with. The cosine of pi over 2, that's a 90-degree angle. Cosine is x, it should be just 0. I don't know why I did equals twice. Okay, so that's how you do the equations. You solve by getting the inverse piece by itself. So we have sine inverse of x equals pi over, or negative pi over 4. Then we are going to take, or sine both sides. So I get x is equal to the sine at negative pi over 4. Well, that's a quadrant 4 angle, and that's where sine is negative. All students take calculus. X equals negative root 2 over 2. Because we're not finding an angle here, we're finding a trig ratio, because the sine inverse isn't there anymore. Divide everything by 16. 4 over 16 is 1 over 4, or pi over 4. Take the tangent of both sides, and we get 2x is equal to the tangent at pi over 4. If you remember correctly, at pi over 4, root 2 over 2 happens for both the sine and the cosine. Those are both their ratios. So when you divide them, you get 1. So we get 2x equals 1, which means x equals 1/2. So those are our 3 solves. And that's all we're doing today. Again, we're basically going backwards on the unit circle with some restrictions. You have to be careful that you are in the correct quadrant and you state the angle the correct way. For example, negative pi over 6 is not, don't say 11 pi over 6. Okay? Otherwise, that's it today. And we're going to keep building on this. So the notes will be probably a little quicker in terms of video notes. So I'll see you next time.